It's my pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Gabriel-Philip Santos. Yeah. Gabe is a paleontologist, educator, storyteller. He is the director of visitor engagement and education at the Alf Museum of Paleontology, and he received his Bachelor's of Science in Biology at the University of California-Irvine and his Master's in Geology at California State University-Fullerton. His previous research interests focus on the Eocene vertebrate fauna of Southern California and the paleobiology of marine mammals, particularly the extinct hippo-like desmostylians. He now focuses his work on science education and engaging audience through projects like the Cosplay for Science initiative. He was a 2021 Teacher Fellow with National Geographic for his work in science education and also as a host for the popular YouTube series PBS Eons. The title of tonight's talk is Weird Walruses and Ocean Hippos, Marine Mammals of Ancient California. Thank you, and please help me welcome Gabriel-Philip Santos.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me on this Friday to talk about marine mammals. Nothing more I would love than to talk about the cool, weird marine mammals of Southern California. So, just to get things started, that is my talk tonight. You all are going to learn about weird walruses and ocean hippos, two very specific marine mammals here in California along the Pacific coast, and two of my favorites, not just because I published on them, but because they're very derpy and weird and awesome. So a little bit, that's my social media stuff. That's a QR code if you ever want to get in contact with me or learn more about my projects later, especially PBS Eons, which I'll talk about also later. So, a little bit more about me. Like I said, I'm Gabriel-Philip Santos. I am born and raised here in Los Angeles. I am a first-generation scientist. I got my BS in BS, which is Biological Sciences from UC Irvine. Okay, good. There are other biologists here in the room. I was originally a pre-med, and then I realized that is definitely not what I want to do with my life. So I kind of didn't do anything for a couple years, and eventually I found my way back into museums, specifically paleontology. And then that's when I went back to school to get my master's degree in geological sciences with emphasis in vertebrate paleontology. From there, I eventually got a job somehow at the Raymond Alf Museum of Paleontology. I started as the collections manager. We are the only nationally accredited paleontological museum on a high school campus. So our researchers are high school students. Our excavators, our main people doing the big work at our museum are high school students. And I have the incredible privilege to work with them and get to publish their work. As I started doing more work, I moved away from collections and academic research and started doing a lot more stuff in science education. And that's how I eventually became the director of visitor engagement and education at the Alf Museum. Now, while I was doing all that really cool stuff, I really looked for new ways to teach people about science. And that's how me and my dear friends came up with a project called the Cosplay for Science Alliance now. Because there's a lot of us, and we pretend we're the Rebel Alliance. Cosplay for Science is this really cool group. We are scientists, cosplayers, educators who love making connections between science and pop culture. In fact, some of the members are in the room here today, like Bane. Everyone look at Bane really quick. Good. Randy and Hannah over here too. So really quick about Cosplay for Science, because that is not the purpose of my talk, even though I could talk about Star Wars animals forever. Coming up on November 2nd, we're going to have a special collaborative event here with the aquarium called Sea of Monsters, where we'll be talking about the creatures and myths from D&D. I'm not going to do that accent. I'm so sorry. But we are going to talk about some really cool creatures, the myths and legends that inspired the world of Dungeons and Dragons. So if you really want to learn about those cool creatures, come on by. Cosplay is welcome. We're going to have a lot of fun D&D stuff. Oops, wrong way. Okay, so while I was doing all that stuff, I also became a National Geographic Grosvenor Teacher Fellow, where it was part of my job to learn how to be a science storyteller. I had the incredible privilege to go to Antarctica and train with some of the best science storytellers in the business. And that's eventually how I became co-host of PBS Eons on YouTube. Like and subscribe, please. We could use it these days. Yes, yeah, that was my last episode. Thank you. That made sure I got paid. Anyway, one of the things that connects all this stuff about me is that I love stories, particularly science stories. Growing up, I would watch Star Wars, Pokemon, things like that, but somehow I always found a way to pull on the little science threads that were woven into those stories. And you could ask my siblings and my parents, I would bore them for hours on end talking about how like one Pokemon was inspired by a horseshoe crab and all the little bits about it. I love doing that, and I've somehow made that into my career. But one of the things that has to do with my paleontology and the storytelling is where that all came from. For me, the world of the ocean is really what inspired a lot of my love of storytelling, because there are so many stories in there that we can learn about our world. That's where life began. That's where our ancient ancestors first decided to leave the water and go onto land. There's so many incredible stories in the ocean, and I love telling them. And there's something special about me being here at the aquarium today, is because when I was a kid, I would come here all the time to learn about those incredible stories of the ocean. One of my favorite quotes from Jacques Cousteau is that the sea, once it casts its spell, holds one in its net of wonder forever. And that's what I mean about those stories. There's so many questions that we can ask that draws us in to learn more about the ocean and also a little bit about ourselves. Also, since I learned that it's the 90th birthday of the Cabrillo Aquarium, I'm almost 40, and that means I was coming here 30 years ago, which is, I'm gonna need to talk to my therapist about later. Anyway, it's really cool to be back here at Cabrillo Aquarium. Looking out onto the beach and into the aquarium, into the water, there's so many amazing things here where you can pull on those stories of the ocean. And another cool thing about it is that here in Cabrillo and San Pedro, and in Southern California in particular, we can look at stories not just from today, but from the past as well. Southern California is really unique because we have such great rocks that tell us more about the history of life on Earth and the history of us in particular. How do we know that, though? Well, again, like I said, we have to look at the rocks. Over here is a geologic map of California. All those cool colors tell us different ages and different time periods that are preserved in the rock. There's an ammonite up there. But all of this is because prehistory, that early history of life on Earth, that's all written in stone. If we think about rocks, the layers of rocks, as different chapters in Earth's history, the deeper down we go, the earlier in Earth's history that we can see. And in coastal Southern California in particular, we have 175 million years worth of geologic stories preserved, right? That's so much incredible knowledge that we can get just by looking at rocks. And as a geologist, that's awesome. There's so many cool things you can get. Ever heard of, some people say that if you can tell the difference between a fossil and a rock is if you lick it, right? That's actually true because we have so many fossils here that I've done that quite a bit, unfortunately. I would recommend not doing that if you find a rock on the ground, though. Make sure it's like at least washed before you try it. But either way, the rocks here in California tell us so many cool things. And like I said, here in California, we have over 175 million years of history. Some of the earliest rocks in California date back to the Jurassic, during the Mesozoic period, the age of reptiles, as we call it in paleontology. Some of my favorite rocks that I studied in my master's comes from the Eocene. During this time, California was actually more of a tropical rainforest with weird animals you wouldn't expect. Little rhinos, horses that you could carry, I know, I would want one so bad. We also had giant snakes and little tiny primates that would live in the trees. It was a completely different world that we can think of today. If we move forward through time, during the Miocene, between 23 and 5 million years ago, most of Southern California was underwater. So today, where we have our mountains, our shopping malls, our freeways, because we're Californian, that was all shallow sea and filled with so many incredible creatures, from dugongs, whales, and the things I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Then you have the Pleistocene all the way to the Ice Age, saber-toothed cats, horses, and eventually leading to today. Now, for me, again, like I said, there's so many cool stories that we can learn from looking at all the rocks. But today in particular, I'm going to talk about two very specific stories from that Miocene age, when most of California was underwater. I'm going to talk about weird walruses and ocean hippos, quote unquote. That's very specific. I will tell you that later. But first up, let's look at the weird walrus. Oh, actually, I forgot about this. Everyone's going to ask me later, so I'm just going to clear it up now. Where are the dinosaurs? Because I'm a paleontologist, it's inevitable, and I don't mind talking about them. But tonight's about the mammals, so I'm going to get this out of the way right now. Dinosaurs in California. They weren't here very often. Most of Southern California during the Mesozoic was underwater. So most of the dinosaur fossils that we have, even it's very, very few, just tiny fragments here and there. And the only ones we do have, they came from bloat and float. Anybody familiar with that term? It's kind of easy to understand if you look at the picture. Yeah, the dinosaurs died further inland. Then they got washed into like a water system, and then they bloated up because they were decomposing. Gases build up in the body. It's all natural. And they get swept out to sea. And then as they decompose, their fossils get deposited where we are now. Now, this image comes from a PBS Eons episode, The Dinosaur Who Was Buried at Sea. This is actually not from California, but if you're in San Diego, they do have an ankylosaur fossil that was bloat and float. It was washed out to sea. But that's the reason we don't have dinosaurs here. Everyone's always asking, where are they? They weren't here. The ones we had, very unlucky day. But if you are interested in dinosaurs, there are some very few dinosaurs that were found in other places of California, and that's how we have our state dinosaur, Augustinolophus morrisi. There's its skull, and that's our new state flag that we're all trying to get approved. But there's the dinosaurs. There's the answer to your question. If you have more questions about dinosaurs, you can ask my friend Randy later. So back on it, mammals. We are mammals, right? Anybody want to guess to what makes a mammal really quick? Live birth, I heard one. What was the other one? Milk, yes, mammary glands. Anyone else? Fur, that's a good one, yeah. So mammals are a very unique group. If we look at the history of time, we're the dominant species or group on the planet now. We are mammals. We have fur. We're warm-blooded. There's mammary glands. We produce milk. We care for our young. It's really cool. But most mammals live on land. During the early Eocene and through parts of early history, some mammals were like, I don't like this. Water looks good. Let's go back. And so what I'm going to talk about is some of those mammals that decided to go back into the water. The first one here are our weird walruses, when walruses were weird. So up on the screen right now is a walrus. You're like, that's not a walrus. Well, during the Miocene, when most of California was underwater, it was very shallow seas and lots of seagrass beds, and that allowed for an incredible diversity of animals that we may not recognize well today. That includes the walruses. So again, on this picture, this is from the amazing artist Ray Troll. You see weird whales, the ocean hippos, and over there, that's another walrus. This is the walrus you're probably familiar with, right? This fat, kind of silly-looking thing. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to call it fat. This large, silly-looking thing with the big tusks, right? These are Otobenus rosmaris. So these are the modern walruses, and we only really consider them living up in the Arctic, where it's cold. They're well adapted for those cold environments. They specialize in eating shellfish, and again, their tusks are very iconic. But here's a funny thing that people don't realize. They are the last of their kind. Walruses are a monotypic species. That means they're the only one left within their entire group. So we need to take care of them. Just remember that. But if we go back in time into the story of life on Earth, during the Miocene, there were so many different kinds of walruses. On this map of the Pacific, you can see some of the many walrus species and different genus or genera that have been identified through paleontology. On the Japanese side, you've got Prototaria, you've got Protobenus, which means early walrus. On top, you see Otobenus rosmaris, ruling all of them, the one walrus to rule them all. Over here on the United States side, you've got Puntolus magnus, Dusognathus, Imagotaria, which means imaginary sea lion. You've got Gomphotaria, which I will talk about later. You've also got more familiar looking walruses down there, and then Titanataria orangensis. Remember that name later. But like I was saying, even though we only have one walrus today, imagine going back into the Miocene and looking out into those shallow seas. seeing all these different kinds of walruses doing different kinds of things. Some were more active predators that were chasing things like modern sea lions do today. And others were very similar to our modern walrus, where they had no teeth whatsoever, and they were just sucking shellfish out of the shell. It's a really hard thing sometimes to create that picture, but it also is something really, really amazing and just a unique part of our story here in California with the sheer number of walruses that once lived here. So here are a few more images and examples of different walruses. Like I talked about earlier, the Gomphotharia pugnax, right? So how many tusks do modern walruses have today? 2, good. Gomphotharia pugnax was weird. They're like, let's double that. So they had 4 tusks. They had 2 on the top, and they had 2 on the bottom, and they crossed each other like this. Yeah, it's super cool and super weird. Its name is kind of rude because pugnax sort of just means ugly face. But it was an amazing, unique creature that we don't see any relatives of today. And we're still not entirely sure why they had the 4 tusks, but that just means more jobs for paleontologists later. You've got things like Otobenus eodon, right, down here. That's more of like the sea lion-like walruses. That's Gomphotharia pugnax, the reconstruction over there. And then you also have things like Pontolus cohonoi, and then Titania orangensis. So again, picture yourself out there if you dare to swim in the Miocene oceans. I wouldn't. There were so many cool things you could picture just from these weird walruses. Nothing like you see today. If you think about the kinds of pinnipeds, the things like seals and sea lions, most of them are fairly smaller compared to these walruses, and they are very sea lion-like, right? They're agile hunters that would swim through the water. It's nothing like the diversity we had back in the Miocene. It's kind of sad thinking about it as a marine mammal paleontologist, but also that means I have a job, so it's fine. Now, Titanotaria orangensis. This is what I was talking about earlier. This one is very special to me because I got to be on the team that helped describe this really, really cool walrus. It was very, very predatory. It was an active hunter that swam through the oceans. You can see it here reconstructed trying to catch the school of fish. And again, if you look at it without me telling you, it would look very much just like a sea lion. Now, Titanotaria orangensis, its name, as its name suggests, was discovered in Orange County. So this is a very, very SoCal-specific taxa. It was found at a construction site down in Orange County. You can see them kind of excavating it there. And it was discovered, it was pretty much complete. It had a complete skull, its jaws were there, almost 90% of its skeleton was preserved. And when they saw it, they pretty much knew right away that this might be something really cool and new, something we'd never seen before. So it was an amazing discovery, and I was very lucky that I had a chance to help describe it. Here are more images of Titanotaria, sometimes called Waldo. One thing that was interesting about this walrus is look carefully at its skull. Do you see sort of weird differences on those little curves on the side of its skull? See how it's kind of misshapen? When we first saw that, some people thought that it might have been just because during fossilization, things can get a little bit deformed because of all the intense pressure and time and things like that. But as we looked more at it, we realized that this specimen had a congenital disease on the entire side of its body as we looked at the rest of the skeleton. So one side of its body was just a little bit smaller and not as strong as the other side. But this thing was able to survive to maturity. So this specimen itself is telling its own really cool story of this walrus that was born in the Miocene in these shallow seas that was living amongst other walruses. And even though it had kind of a smaller flipper and the smaller side of its body, it managed to survive and grow into a really, really powerful adult. One thing that you can't quite see on these images is this specimen has a scar that runs through its eye. So it actually got in a fight at some point with either another walrus or maybe something larger, and it was like, come on, bring it on. And it fought and survived. So this guy is really, really cool and a really cool survivor. And again, just another really cool story from the history of life on Earth here in California. Here's a 3D reconstruction of Titania orangensis. And when I rotate it, you can see the congenital disease a little bit better. So this side, and then when you rotate compared to the other side, you can really see how one side is just smaller and not as developed as the other. So this, again, was really cool. Oh, actually, I think you can see the scar here. Oops. Yeah, so you see that little bump right there on the top of its head? There's like two little bumps there. That was the scar that it has. I'm gonna rotate one more time. So it's right there. There's two little bumps right on top of its eye. That's the scar, something going through its eye. So again, Titanataria orangensis, just one of the last that we found in all these really weird walruses from Southern California. Now, walruses, weird during the Miocene, super cool, cute, probably, depending on who you are. Now, we're going to talk about something really, really cute. We're going to talk about my favorite, the ocean hippos, quote unquote. These things are desmostylians. Who here has ever heard of a desmostylian? Oh, good, a few of you? Oh man, that's the most amount of people who have ever said yes. So desmostylians are a really cool, unique marine mammal. We call them hippo-like because if you look at their body, they are quite hippo-like. And we do think that they were kind of amphibious. They were able to live on land and in water, and that's where we think they fed on seagrass. But this unique group of marine mammals lived in the Pacific coast from about 33 million years ago to about 10 million years ago. You can see we have fossils of them from Japan all the way to Russia, Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, and all the way down here to Southern California and even reaching Baja. Now, while they lived in the North Pacific coast, they were quite, they had quite large populations. We find their teeth in the fossil record all the time. But unfortunately, desmostylians are the only completely extinct group of marine mammals. They have no living descendants today. And so because of that, we actually don't know that much about them, which is pretty weird considering how many of them we find in the fossil record. And when we look at Desmostylia, what we do know about them is that the order Desmostylia has about 3 main groups that we kind of look at, 2, 3, depending on who you talk to. But first up, we have the earlier ones, which were the behematopsids. Have you heard of the behemoth? It's like an ancient monster legend. That's what they were named after. Then you've got the desmostylids. Those are the ones that I really, really love to talk about and that I've studied. And then you also have the paleoparadoxiids. Their name means ancient mystery, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But these are the 3 main groups of desmostylians. Do they look cute to you yet? Yeah? Okay, good. How about now? Do they look really cute? So this is what we think desmostylians might have looked like when you give them skin. They're these really cool amphibious creatures that would, wade out from the shallow water looking for plants all the way to the seagrass beds. And because, again, during the Miocene, California had these shallow seas with large seagrass beds, these creatures thrived in that environment. So imagine yourself in the Miocene of California, and you walk off to the beach and you look out into the water and you see herds of desmostylians, rivaling maybe some of the megaherds of the Sahara. Not like the California we know today, right? Again, just a whole other world that you can imagine and put yourself in and try to figure out what was happening then. When I say that they're hippo-like, you can really kind of make that pretty easy, especially when you look at their skulls. So here you've got paleoparadoxids, and on the, what side is that for you? On your right? On your right, you have a hippo skull. They both kind of have an elongated skull. They've got tusks in the front of their mouth. They have rows of teeth that they use for eating grass. Their eyes are kind of elevated up onto the top of their skull so they can kind of surface and look around before having to go back underwater. So you can really see that. And this is an example of something in paleontology that we call convergent evolution, where 2 groups of animals, unrelated or not even closely related, evolve to look very similar because they live in similar environments. It's quite possible, but there's a big difference between these 2. Hippos, first of all, they're found in Africa, and they are actually not as marine or aquatic as the desmostylians in the way that we think. Hippos, while they do live in the water, they actually spend most of their time eating out of water. They live in the water as a way to avoid predators, to stay cool, but when it gets cooler, they come out and they graze on the grasses that are around their water holes. Desmostylians, on the other hand, we hypothesize that they spent most of their time in the water feeding on the seagrass, coming closer to shore probably to have young or to chill out, relax on the beach, So Californian, right? But it's a really cool way to kind of think about things, and the way in paleontology and the story of life on Earth is how similar things can be, but also just how different they are. And another thing too, this is just such me being pedantic, when we call paleoparadoxids or desmostylians ocean hippos, it should be the other way around, because they were here first. So we should call these things river desmostylids, but that's not gonna catch on. It's like fetch, but whatever. So again, looking more at desmostylians, here's a really wonderful reconstruction from Cullen Townsend. He's a good friend and a wonderful science illustrator. Has anybody been to the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County? Okay, so if you go in there, if you go into the LA Underwater exhibit, all of those illustrations were done by him. Also, my photo is in there too, if you want to check it out. But he did a really great job reconstructing this paleoparadoxid that's on display in the Hall of Mammals. Now, looking closely at it, you can really see, again, those hippo-like similarities from the head to its body shape. But one big difference between the two is the feet. So desmostylians have these big, as my former curator used to say, puppy dog feet, because they're just big. And we think that they might use them to paddle with the front. Now, the really weird thing is their back legs. It's hard to tell here, but if I use the skeleton, their back legs, they have a weird twist in them. They're twisted inward. We're still not entirely sure what that is about. It's just a weird thing that we see in the taxa, but because we don't have a modern analog, we're not entirely sure what it was for. Hippos have kind of actually very skinny, like column-like legs to support their weight out of water. They're good swimmers, but they don't need to be like paddling compared to like desmostylians that live in the ocean. One hypothesis for their leg is because they're turned inward. If you look at polar bears, they have a very similar twist in their legs, and when they swim, they use their front legs to push water, and they use their back legs as rudders. Because they're twisted inward, they can kind of do this like a boat rudder, and they can control where they're swimming. This is how I think they swim. But that's another cool thing about these desmostylians, again, it's just like, they're so weird. I think they're derpy and cute, but there's so many mysteries about them and so many stories we can tell. Now, desmostylians, they are really most known for their incredibly unique teeth. They have a strange morphology. They also have the thickest enamel of any mammal. So the enamel is the outer layer of our teeth, right? So ours is fairly thin, but in desmostylians, it's super thick. You can kind of see in these images, in this image of two desmostylian teeth, that little circle in the middle and there's a circle on the outside, that outer circle is the enamel layer. So it's super, super thick. And again, their morphology, the shape of the tooth is super weird. We really don't see anything like it in today's world. I like to call them little sushi rolls all stuck together, right? You can kind of see it. I'm hungry. But the other fun thing about desmostylian is this is where they get their name from. Desmos in Greek means bound, and stylus means column. So their teeth look like a bunch of columns all bound together. And so that's where they get their name. Because again, desmostylian teeth, I said this way earlier, is one of the most common things you can find in them. If you go all along the coasts of North America, all the way to Japan, you find so many of these teeth in the Miocene fossil record. It's so crazy that we have so many of them. But even though we have this many desmostylian teeth, if you try to look up desmostylians online, right? This is how I type with one finger. If you actually try to look up desmostylians online, you're going to find a lot of weird reconstructions of them and actually not a lot of information. And that's because we really, really don't know much about them. They were described in 1888 by the famous paleontologist Nathaniel Marsh. But even since then, there's only been a few descriptions of complete specimens of their skull, and even less about their ecology, their habits, their supposed swimming habits. It's just because there hasn't been as much interest in desmostylians throughout the ages. I mean, when I was studying when I was doing academic paleontology and studying desmostylians, there was really only about 5 of us in the whole world who were really studying them at the time. That's actually a funny story because When I was in my master's program, almost all of the major desmostylian researchers in the world had come to California, and they were going to go on a trip to Mexico to look for new desmostylian fossils. And me being a grad student was like, can I come, please? I want to go. And then my good friend, Brian Beatty, Dr. Brian Beatty, who was a desmostylian expert, looked at me and grabbed me on the shoulder and was like, no, Gabe, because if anything happens to us, you're all that's left. And I was like, that's not a good excuse. If you just don't want to pay for me, you just say so. But anyway, it's still like a cool thing because there are so many mysteries about this creature. There's so many stories left to tell. And that's why I became really, really obsessed with desmostylians when I first started in paleontology. I mean, look at these two skulls. If you walked into a museum and you just saw that, even real paleontologists are like, what the heck is that? There's so many weird features in their skull and their body that just aren't really intuitive to understand what they were doing. And for me, as someone who loves weird things in general, of course I fell in love with them. I fell in love with them so much that when I went to Japan for the very first time, I made a very specific trip to the Osaka Aquarium just to see an exhibit about desmostylians. Half of my camera was just pictures of me at this museum. And everybody in that museum was looking at this American, just getting excited over these animals that everyone was like, what are these, hippos? And I'm like, actually, but they're super cool, again, just because of the mystery behind them. And I love them so much, they actually became my very first foray into paleontology. When I was first starting in paleontology, I was working at the Orange County Paleontological Collection down near Santa Ana. And while I was going through some of the fossils and helping organize them, I came across this thing. This immediately caught my eye because I first thought it was this kind of elephant creature called a dinothere. So imagine an elephant with tusks that come out of its mouth and turn downwards. You can kind of see with that downturned tusk there, I was like, maybe a dinothere. And then my curator at the time, she was all like, try again. And so I spent so much time trying to figure out what it was until eventually I figured out that it was a desmostylian. Just a really weird one. This is OCPC 22650. It's a very large desmostylian jaw. And the weird thing about it is that it didn't have any teeth whatsoever. Now you're probably thinking, Gabe, you just told me that teeth are the most common thing with desmostylians in the fossil record. And I was like, you'd be right, and thank you for listening. But this creature right here really confused the heck out of me. How do I have a very large adult desmostylian, but it doesn't have any teeth? Well, maybe it fell out. Well, in most cases, when teeth fall out, there's evidence of the hole, the tooth socket, still there to say that, yeah, there was once a tooth in that place. But this thing didn't have any tooth sockets. Its jaw was solid bone. And we're like, okay, what is happening here? How is this a desmostylian, but it doesn't have one of its most iconic features, right? Where's the teeth? Where are the tooth sockets? Also, why is this jaw so big? Like, look at the robustness and the thickness of that bone, right? Maybe it was a new species. I mean, as a person starting in paleontology, who wouldn't want to name a new species? I was like, I'll do it, sure, I'll take it on. But of course, I had to go through the scientific process before I could ever make that decision. So for this story, I had the really cool opportunity to go visit other museums around California and even Japan, and I got to look at all the different desmostylian jaws that they have. Here we have a specimen from UCMP, the University of California Museum of Paleontology up in Berkeley. So this is another desmostylian jaw, right? They look somewhat similar, but look at some of the differences. What's the biggest difference? Can anyone point out? You right there. Uh-huh. So it looks like it has teeth, it has the tusk, and it looks like the jaws are connected in the middle. Great job. Yeah. Well, that little ridge, really quick, I was like weird too, but that's matrix. That's rock. That wasn't prepared out. That was just to hold it in place. But don't worry, that's an easy mistake. The biggest thing that was difference here is there are tooth sockets on this other specimen. You can kind of see in the lower part of the jaw, see those holes there? That's where the teeth went. Those are where the roots of the teeth would fit into the jaw. Now, the other thing too is that this is a much slender jaw, right? It's not as big and robust. Sure, it's missing tusks, but that could be from it falling out over time, not being preserved, right? There are a lot of things that can happen to bones and fossils after it fossilizes. But the most important thing is that this one definitely had teeth at some point. So you can see OCPC 22650 and the UCMP specimen. Big differences, but they're both still desmostylians. Looking at more specimens, I went to the LA County Museum up in downtown LA, and I found this little piece of the back end of a desmostylian jaw, and this one luckily still had its teeth in place. But if you look, the bone density and the size of it compared to my desmostylian, it looks very similar, right? Even if it doesn't have the rest of the jaw there, just that little portion looks very similar to my desmostylian. So starting to pick at the pieces, right? Or put the pieces together, figuring out what is happening here. We have a desmostylian that has slender jaw, that has the little holes in it still. We found a piece of a large desmostylian that probably had a very similar morphology to mine, but it still had its teeth. So where are my teeth? Things started to really come together for me when I got to go see some other specimens. Now this is GSJ-F7745. This is a juvenile desmostylian. This is a young little one. And you can see big differences here. Its jaw is much more slender. You can kind of see the beginnings of its two front tusks, right? And it's got its little teeth, its little milk teeth, deciduous teeth, sometimes that we call it. When I saw those deciduous teeth and started looking at other desmostylians, I was starting to really put together the story of what was happening here and why my desmostylian ended up the way it did. And that all had to do with the way that desmostylians erupt their teeth, or the way that their teeth come in. And that's when eventually we figured out this desmostylian wasn't born toothless. It had lost its teeth over time. This was the jaw of a very old, maybe grumpy, I don't know. If you lose your teeth, I would assume so. But this was a very old desmostylian that lost its teeth over time. And what was happening was that desmostylians have a very unique ontogeny, or life stages, as they go from very young adult to a senescent or very old adult. And it all has to do with the way that their teeth grow in and what they're eating and where they're living. So let's start at the early stages of desmostylians. Here we have a mom and a juvenile. When they're juveniles, we hypothesize that desmostylians perhaps were living more inland in like freshwater and eating on soft little freshwater plants. And we hypothesize this because desmostylians as juveniles, they don't have the big, robust teeth that adults. They only have these little ones, right? And then when they're little, it's not as adapted to wear and tear. And also because they lose it. We think that that's why they were living in the shallow fresh water. Also, it's away from predators. That little thing, probably a snack for a megalodon. I don't know. Sorry, I didn't mean to make that really sad for people. But anyway, desmostylian, this is the early life stages as a juvenile. Now, what we were figuring out is that eventually, as they got older, those freshwater environments probably weren't sustaining them as much, and this wasn't their main environment. We know that desmostylians spent most of their time in shallow lagoonal seagrass beds. Now, in seagrass beds, seagrass is this really cool plant that is the only marine plant and flowering plant, and their plant structure, or their leaf structure, actually has a lot of silica in it. Now, silica is a mineral. If you've ever been at the beach and you're having too much of a good time and some sand gets in your mouth and you bite down and you feel that really awful crunch, that's the silica connecting and crunching with your enamel, right? It's not good. It's not a great feeling. Now, imagine doing that all the time as a desmostylian. Desmostylians had these really robust teeth with the really thick enamel as a possible adaptation to eating seagrass. Because the enamel's so thick, they could eat seagrass and be able to resist wear as much as they could from the really, really rough seagrass. Now again, as a baby, they couldn't really do it as much. But as they got bigger, they were able to go into deeper water and eventually eat that seagrass. Now here's the thing. Enamel is not invincible. it's going to wear down regardless over time. So what we're hypothesizing is that with desmostylians, because they grow these different sets of teeth through their life that get bigger and bigger, they do about 3 changes of teeth, that's just adapting so that they always have fresh teeth, essentially, as they're eating more seagrass. But that last set, if they live long enough, is not going to last forever. And that's what we think happened with OCPC 22650. We think that eventually this specific individual was eating seagrass for most of its life and eventually lost its teeth. Now, for most animals, if you lose your teeth, that's kind of it. You can't eat, right? That sucks, but that's how it goes. So if you can't eat, you die. You're not gonna show evidence of remodeling or whatever. But with this specimen, it shows evidence in its jaw that it was able to live past losing its teeth. Its alveoli, the tooth sockets, were filled in. They restructured the bone essentially so that it would close it up, and then it became much more denser over time so that it just closed up and became a whole new structure. And what we think what they were doing is that they were no longer eating seagrass. There was another kind of aquatic plant-like thing that was first appearing in the fossil record at this time, and that's kelp. Now, kelp, you don't need teeth to eat. You can just gum that stuff like crazy. Not that I know, I just heard about it. These are my teeth. But with other creatures we know of that are edentulous or don't have teeth, they were eating kelp. They were evolving at this time. So we have evidence of other creatures that didn't need teeth to eat kelp. So putting the pieces together, we were really hypothesizing that this desmostylian, after it lost its teeth, after it remodeled its jaw, was able to go into deeper water because also it was so big that other predators probably weren't attacking it. They can go in deeper water where the kelp was and just gum all day. So earlier I said it was grumpy. I assume actually it was just living its best old life because it was just floating, eating kelp all day long. That sounds awesome. So that is kind of what we think was happening with this story of desmostylians and my first foray into science. And again, why I love desmostylians so much and just marine mammals in general, right? With these fossils, these things that we learn, each one of them tells a new story. Every fossil is worth 1,000 stories, especially in the marine realm, right? So many questions of how did things go from land to water? What adaptations were needed? Once you get in water, right? How do you have babies? How do you protect yourself from predators? What are you eating? How are you adapting to changing seasons in the water? Things like that. It's one of those things, again, that for me, those stories from the ocean and life in water, that really keeps me going as a paleontologist to find the answers to those stories and share them with people. And again, that brings us back to this whole story of life on Earth, right? Over the millennia, there have been so many incredible stories in the ocean, on land, and things like that. But I think the most important thing is that all these past stories, we can use them today to help inform an understanding of the modern world, which here in Cabrillo, all the way across the globe. And we can use that in turn to help us prepare for the next chapters that are going to be written in the history of life on Earth. Perhaps you will be the one to write those chapters. But overall, it's a really, really cool thing, and I'm so glad all of you stuck through to listen to me gush and talk about my favorite marine mammals. So thanks, everybody. Just a couple things. That's my QR code again. If you want to get in touch with me, that's me on social media. Catch me on PBS Eons, youtube.com/PBS Eons. Please like and subscribe. I'm sure some of you heard PBS is not doing great at the moment, but if every like and subscribe and donation helps to continue bringing these incredible stories to people who need them and who love them. And don't forget, November 2nd, D&D. I will probably be a pirate. We'll see. Not the accent, though.
All right, thank you so much, Gabe. That was wonderful. We have time for some questions, and I'd like to remind everybody we have hot mics above you. So all those mics are on, so everybody at home will be able to hear what you say. So we'll take some questions from the audience for Gabe, and then I'll see if there's anybody at home. Please type in your questions, and I will read them out. But please, some questions for Gabe about awesome desmostylia.
In the back.
You mentioned that your desmotylian, that last one, the elder one, had no teeth and was filled in. Since there's so many teeth records around the Pacific Rim, do you see evidence of progression where you have the juveniles with their minor teeth, adults with most of their teeth, and significant progression of loss of teeth? Or is it just this one that you saw without the loss of teeth?
This is the only one that I saw with like complete loss of teeth and the remodeling, like the whole sockets being filled in. But we did see some other evidence of it occurring in some of the other specimens that we looked at. The real important thing is that desmostylians, I didn't really go into just because it's like really heavy science stuff, but desmostylians have this thing called delayed dental ontogeny. That just means that they wait. They don't forcefully wait. They have the stages that their teeth erupt. So like for us humans, we only have two stages, right? We have deciduous teeth, our baby teeth. Those fall out, the tooth fairy comes, and then a new one comes in. Desmostylians, they actually delay the eruption of all of their adult molars. So they lose their baby teeth, and then the first set of molars comes out, right? And they use that for a little bit. As time goes on, those wear down. The second set is delayed so that it erupts later on, and they have a fresh set as the front ones are worn down and pushed forward. Then eventually that second set, and then a third final set that's much bigger and robust erupts, pushes forward, and they're ready to go for a little bit longer. So the delayed dental eruption, along with looking at those other specimens where we start to see the evidence of tooth loss, that really helped us build our story. Now, one really quick thing about paleontology is none of this is for certain, right? In paleontology, we are looking at fractures of evidence from the past, and we're interpreting that. The story is always going to change as we find new evidence. That's just science. Science is iterative. So I may say something about desmostylians today, and my colleague is going to publish a paper next week and like, haha, you were wrong. But that's okay. That's how science goes. You were there.
Why does the bottle with the teeth, the mouth, I found that it looks like an eel.
It looks like an eel?
Eel.
I mean, I never thought about it that way, but now I will. It could be, so desmostylians, like they, hippos have like a square head, right? Desmostylians have a much longer head, almost horse-like, right? And the front's like rounded out where their tusks come out. We think that's because as they were in the water, they needed to be able to get seagrass. So their front face with their tusks and a little bit flat helped them pull seagrass out with their head directly downward. It was just a way to easier get seagrasses out. How about you talk with me when we go outside and we can have a really long discussion? Because I know you have a lot of possible hypotheses for me, and I really want to learn them.
So they disappeared around 10 million years ago, and they were on near Japan as well. And they disappeared there around the same time. Was there some sort of environmental change that happened during that period of time that possibly led to their extinction?
Yeah. So I don't know why I was excited about that. Yes. So during the Miocene, actually, we see a period of global cooling, right? And during that period, as the coastal the shallow coastal seas were going away, that meant the seagrasses were disappearing. When those seagrass beds disappear, we don't have desmostylians along with the many other cast of characters that rely on them. So it was a period of global cooling because from the Miocene, it's really hot. You're going to go down all the way to the Pleistocene, down to the ice ages. So you really see that global cooling. And seagrasses, we only have seagrass today in equatorial areas. They really need like that warm tropical area to survive in. So just an evidence of the more natural cycles of climate change that the Earth has gone through. Anyone else?
You have a favorite fun fact?
Sorry?
Favorite fun fact?
A favorite fun fact? Yeah, here's one. Did you know that there's a Pokemon that was inspired by climate change? So, okay, I'm gonna get started now. So in Pokemon, there's the second generation, there's a Pokemon called Corsola. Corsola is inspired by corals. Go down through time as we reach Galar, right? They introduce a new regional form called Galarian Corsola. It's a ghost type that is white. What happens is that is the direct interpretation of coral bleaching that we see today. So corals that in our world, as temperature rises, they expel the not parasitic, the symbiotic. Thank you. It's been a long week. The symbiotic algae that's in their body, when they expel it, they bleach, they turn white. And then sometimes they can recover, but sometimes they won't and they'll die. And in the world of Pokemon, the Galarian Corsola that lived there, the seas dried out and they died and turned into ghost type Pokemon. So it's just a really cool way that science inspires the world of fiction. That's what we do in Cosplay for Science. All right, back there.
Any way of understanding evolutionary time? Because we're talking millions of years. So how do you conceptualize that in your own mind?
How do I understand that? Ooh, I think when I was going through my geology classes and we were learning about sedimentary structures, you can really start to see how these layers in the earth, as they pile up on top of each other, they really are like pages of the chapters of a book, right? And you can literally read them from the bottom upward as you go through time, and really starting to see the different rock layers and the fossils that are found in them. When you put it all together, you step back and you look at that deep time perspective, as we say, you really can see how much time has changed and actually how little time we've been here. If you look at just our layers on Earth, if you put it like on a time scale, that scaling from the amount of time where there was no life on Earth to how much time there, when the first appearance of life, to even just the amount of time the dinosaurs were around, that scale really, really starts to like influence the way you start to see things. Although I'm still somewhat impatient waiting 20 minutes though, so. Do you have another question?
So I think there was another one about weather. There was another one called, I forgot its name, but it's in my book. It's like there's a basic and it goes four. So it's basically summer, winter, fall.
That's Deer Lane, and we can talk about Pokemon outside. Don't worry, I got you. You have a question back there?
Yeah, I'm interested. You mentioned there's so many different mysteries. So what are the mysteries about desmostylians that you're investigating now?
I will say I'm no longer investigating them. Most of my research now focuses on education, but there's so much, like, we still don't actually know how they swam properly. We have hypotheses just based on their morphology, but we have no idea. We also don't know how they stood. So if you look at some of the reconstructions, some of them draw them like kind of more reptilian sprawling out. Some draw them like with their legs more columnar. There's that one weird one that made them look sort of like seal-like, I guess. So we don't know how they stood. We don't know. We're still trying to figure out like if there was sexual dimorphism amongst the desmostylians. There's so many things. I mean, that goes across the board in all of paleontology, right? Again, we're only looking at little pieces of evidence left behind on a very rare occasion. So there are tons of questions about everything in paleontology, even Spinosaurus. I'm just kidding. That's a paleo joke. One more question, right? Oh, okay.
You mentioned the paleoparadoxes.
Yeah.
That they have like a twist inward. You said it's like maybe could be used as rudders. Do you have any like distinguishing features on the behemotopsids?
Yeah, so really two things. The way that their feet were inward and rudders,
Yeah.
that just to clarify for everyone, that's my hypothesis and a few others.
Alright.
We don't have strong direct evidence that is exactly how they swam. That's just us comparing their morphology to modern polar bears, which have a similar twist. So we're making a very strong like hypothesis here, but bold claims require really strong evidence, and we don't have that yet. So just don't take that word for word. That's just what I think. because I don't want everyone going out telling, did you know that paleoparadoxes swam like polar bears? This guy, Gabriel Santos, told us. So yes, so that's my hypothesis. But behematopsids are found much earlier than both desmostylians and paleoparadoxids. Depending on who you talk to, they either are more a type of paleoparadoxid or an early group, earlier ancestor of both groups. Their teeth were much less derived, which means they didn't look like desmostylian teeth completely. They were starting to just sort of look like that bound column, right? And they weren't as big as the other desmostylians and paleoparadoxids. As far as I know, I think that's kind of some of the main features. I mean, they do have some other more specific things in the skull and the rest of their body. But again, that's just because they're much older. They were first appeared around the Oligocene. So that was much earlier. There was about 33 million years. And then the Miocene is about 20 something, right? So they were around 10 million years before the Miocene. And that Miocene is when we get the desmostylians and paleoparadoxids.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Gabe, let's take a few questions from home on Zoom. Aaron wants to know, is there a PBS Eons video that talks about desmostylians?
No, I want that to so bad. So here's the thing about PBS Eons, right? Our writers are amazing and I love talking with them. But when they do stories on PBS Eons, there has to be a good, compelling story beyond, here's a cool creature. With desmostylians, because we don't know that much about them overall, the story isn't quite there. We need more work before our writers can be comfortable writing a good story about them for PBS Eons. So I'm asking my colleagues to hurry and work on desmostylians. But no, I really wish there was a desmostylian episode. Every time I see one of our head writer, Farhan, he's like, I'm working on it, Gabe, don't worry. I'm like, thank you.
And I just want to let you know that there's a bunch of comments coming in from Zoom saying, fantastic lecture, thank you, that was wonderful. Yes, very good. And then I'll have one more question from Zoom and then maybe one more from the audience. But Alice just wants to know what projects you're working on now.
So my current project is Cosplay for Science Alliance. So what we are actually part research too. We like to study and understand how pop culture affects people's perceptions of science. A lot of folks may not realize this, but a lot of us, especially in this modern era, our first interaction with science is through popular media. From the movies we read to the comic books, video games, even on social media. For a lot of us, that's how we first engage, and that's how we build our lexicon of science knowledge from the words and things like that. It may not be as accurate, but that's how you build some of your very first understanding. Now, what we do with Cosplay for Science is we go in and we try to make those connections between that lexicon to the actual concepts. We help people engage with scientists, and we're studying how we can better use pop culture and storytelling to get more people to appreciate science and utilize it and use critical thinking in their everyday lives and interests. So like, we can talk to you about climate change and pollution and Star Wars. Maybe the next time you watch a movie that has climate change and pollution, you're thinking a little bit more, and maybe that develops more critical thinking, more understanding, more broader connections. And then maybe if you have to make a choice about what car you want to drive or what kind of bill you're voting for, you've developed more of that lexicon to make a more informed decision through pop culture, like Star Wars and Pokemon. Who knew?
Wow, I think we should end it there. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Dave.
Thanks, everybody.